Today on the Lowdown, a Down syndrome podcast, Marla Folden gives us the lowdown on supporting your child's speech development. Over to you, Hannah and Marla.
Thanks, Danielle. This episode is brought to you by our Season 10 sponsor, the Ames Family Foundation. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Lowdown podcast. My name is Hannah, and today is a very special episode because I am very excited to finally have my wonderful co-host Marla Folden on the other side of the mic, talking about something she is very, very passionate about. Hello, Marla. How are you?
I am very well. I thought I was going to squeak by without anyone noticing that I haven't been a guest, but here we are.
It only took 10 seasons, but we finally got you on the other side of the mic, and I'm very excited because this is a really interesting topic. So this week, we are talking all things speech. We will be doing a much-needed deep dive into how the whole system works, the many ways it cannot work, and what your friendly neighborhood speech language therapist can do to support speech development. Marla completed her Master's of Science at McGill University in Speech Language Pathology. While attending McGill, she ran a research project about intensive speech treatment for teens with Down syndrome and childhood apraxia of speech. Marla has been a speech therapist at the DSRF since the end of 2016, but the ties go back much further with her original role in programs starting in 2011. Marla is the proud sister of a wonderfully fabulous person named Karina, who has Down syndrome, and a mom to two extremely delightful children who have another syndrome. Like many parents who have kids with extra needs, Marla juggles working, parenting, and adventuring, and somehow makes it all fit into the waking hours. This is largely due to her wonderful husband, who also works in the same field and juggles half the moving pieces at any given time. So we're so excited. Welcome officially to the Lowdown podcast.
Ooh, thank you so much. I'm excited for this topic. It's one of my favorites.
Yeah. I mean, some really interesting discussions to have about this, and I'm excited to learn myself a little bit more. But as you know, in the grand tradition, we're going to ask you some secret questions. And these questions were even a secret from Marla until now. So very
I have no idea
what's coming at you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, question number one. Marla, if you had an unlimited supply of one thing, what would it be?
Ooh, books. Definitely books.
Okay.
I think books can be with you on any journey or side quest that you might be on in life. And there's a book to match just about any feeling. So
love it.
Definitely books.
Great. And just by happenstance, this next question has to do with books. So look at that.
Fabulous.
You and I know each other really well. Okay. If you could write a book that was guaranteed to be a bestseller, what would you write?
Ooh, great question. You know, I would love to see myself as a sort of fantasy fiction writer, which I have in fact attempted to do before.
Okay.
And my enthusiasm usually peters out at around 20 pages, which is not exactly book length. So, you know, there's that. I've also have a fully completed children's book about having an aunt with Down syndrome that I just have never sent anywhere. So, you know, maybe that.
Yeah. Oh, yes, please.
I know.
I think
just
that
there to drawer
right away. Yeah, that's
something
amazing. I love that. Okay, and then the final question. If you could, being a parent and a therapist that works primarily with kids, if you could hang out with any cartoon character, who would you choose and why?
Oh, definitely the grannies from Bluey.
Okay, tell me about the grannies from Bluey.
Well, they are spicy. They're here for a good time. That show is fabulous in general, and they are really, really funny. And in fact, I think I'll be one for Halloween. So there you go.
Wonderful. I like that. Shout out to Bluey. Send us free merch if you'd like.
Yes, please.
Yes, Bluey is very popular at the DSRF. Okay, thank you for doing that, Marla. Okay, so before we dive into the topic of the day, can you define speech versus language? Because I think both of those terms kind of get confused sometimes. So for our listeners, can you do that?
Yes.
At the beginning?
I definitely can. And they kind of run into each other and they overlap around some boundaries. So we can definitely talk about that. Let's define talking or speech as the ability to use your mouth to make meaning or words to communicate effectively with others. The key there being the mouth and the sounds. And it's distinct from communicating, which is the bigger umbrella term for speech, but also writing, signing, using an AAC, texting, body language, gestures, pointing, those kinds of things. And language are the concepts that you can understand and share with somebody else. So speech being the sounds, language being more like the words or the concepts themselves. And from the get-go, we have to be clear today that you can be a really, really, really great communicator without talking at all.
Very good.
With your mouth, without making any sounds. And if we stop and think about it, we all know examples of this. So if we think about a silent film, you know what's happening in that film. The concepts are communicated really clearly. There's no sound. There's no talking. If we think about a celebrity like Stephen Hawking, great communicator. No talking, no sound, right? So those two things are not the same. And I think we should start with that.
And I think that's the thing, is that the words get so interchangeably used that the meaning gets lost in what conversation are we trying to have, because we have lots of families that will talk about not speaking nonverbal, but putting that as the only form of communication. And it's great that you outlined that there's so many other ways that we can communicate messages to each other.
Many. And in fact, most of us as adults who are probably listening to this, we're not actually using sound and talking as our primary way of communicating. A lot of us send a lot of emails. We do a lot of texting. We do a lot of eyebrow raising and people across the room. All of those things are communicating. If we only had talking, our effectiveness in life would be limited quite a bit, because we actually need other things like writing and emails and that kind of thing.
Absolutely. Great. So why is talking so hard for kids with Down syndrome?
A big one. A big one.
I know
this
lots
is a big question that I've kind of devoted my career to thus far, in large part. It's a very fascinating one. And I think we have to remember that talking or speech involves very fast, very precise timing of many body systems working together like a symphony. It's really like quite a marvel when you dive into it. So the way that I think I'll answer this is we're going to take a bit of a body tour, Miss Frizzle style. I even have my Miss Frizzle shirt on today. So that we can just take a journey through the body and see what's happening. So talking actually starts in the brain, in different specific areas of the brain, which we call the language areas. They have formal names, Wernicke and Broca's areas. And this is where our ideas come from. And so this would be the language. So we have concepts forming in the brain, and those concepts get made into motor plans and programs. Like, how do we move our body to convey these concepts? We choose the words, we choose the order of the words, we choose the movements that form the words. This is motor planning and programming. And this is very minute details, and it's not conscious. You don't think, okay, if I'm going to do an H sound, I have to breathe out. I'm going to do this. I have to move my tongue like that. This is all happening in milliseconds. It's very, very fast. And then we have some overarching things that also need to be applied to our plan. And this would be things like intonation and prosody. So the way that you say things changes what they mean. So, I like rainy days versus I like rainy days versus I like rainy days. Same words, different intonation, different prosody, different meaning. Right? And so we have to map that over the top. And then, so once we have all that organized in the brain, then we have to go and do it. So to execute this plan in the matter of milliseconds, we have to time it with our breathing. We have to do this on an exhale. Inhalations will not work. We need the right amount of air pressure to get the whole thought out at once. Otherwise, we sound robotic. We sound disjointed, and we lose meaning. So if we go back to the rainy days example, if I go, I like rainy days, and breathe where I'm not really meant to within the context of that phrase, the meaning gets lost. People don't understand what I'm saying. So we have to get air organized. We have to keep that sequence in our working memory. So don't lose track of that. And then we have the sort of symphony act with all of our what scientists call articulators. So we're talking about the tongue, the jaw, the cheeks, the roof of the mouth, the lips, all playing a part to modify this airflow coming from lungs, being filtered by the voice box on and off and on and off, depending on the needs of the sounds. Everything's got to move, and it's got to come out in the right order, at the right force, at the right time. I hope you're getting the feeling that this is complicated.
Yes.
When this is all happening, we are also needing to listen to our own selves, right? We might need to modify it on the fly. We had our plan. We might need to change it. If there's a sudden loud noise, we have to get louder. If there's a sudden drop in the environmental noise, we should probably get quieter so that we're not perceived as shouting.
Competing,
right?
Yeah.
So we have to be able to listen to it. And then we have to watch our listener or our communication partner to see if they're getting it. And if they're not getting it, we might need to stop, start over, adjust, change it, pick different words. And all of this is not happening with conscious thought. This is happening below the level of consciousness, where usually in our conscious thought, we're thinking about what we're going to say next, or we're anticipating a reply. So this is really complicated. Speech is really, really, really tough.
Yeah.
Oh boy. So that was just what is speech. And then now let's talk about why is this hard for kids with Down syndrome. Does that sound like a good next step?
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. I think it's great that you given the overall physiological picture, because I think very few people realize the complexities of how we form a word or a sound even. So it's a good thing to kind of know, because I think it'll help people understand more why it's difficult for people.
Totally. I think so too. There's just so many layers and so many details. And of course, usually in children who are more or less typically developing, this happens over the course of the first 1, 2, 3 years of their life. And it appears to be somewhat effortless for these children.
Yeah.
Right? This is not something that we often need to intervene on, because kids do so much listening in their environment. They do so much experimentation with their own mouth that they just, quote unquote, pick it up. This very, very complex thing. And then when it's not working, we have to look at all of the layers of the things I've just described to figure out what the problems are. So back to the question of why is this so hard for kids with Down syndrome in particular? The short answer is that all of the steps that I just described are affected by having Down syndrome. Every single one of those. So the idea, the planning, the breathing, the timing, the coordination, the using the right force, the right range of motion, the ability to isolate individual parts to make those sounds recognizable by another person. There's names for the challenges that I'm going to actually go through here, because people might have heard them from their speech therapist and not gotten the full picture of how those things fit in with everything else. So the first of these that we're going to talk about is cognitive delay. So what does this really mean? What this means with regards to speech is that people need more time to come up with the ideas, the words, the grammar, the inflection of a phrase. They just need some more time to do that. And conversation might go on without them. So then they're feeling the pressure of speeding up when they don't have the gas in the tank to speed up in that way.
Yeah, that's kind of where the breathing would come into as well.
Right.
Yeah, okay.
That's right. And so the words in somebody's brain might be a bit disorganized or hard to remember. And this aspect is part of language, but talking and speech is only as important as having something to say. You need something to talk about. So that's why I'm mentioning it here.
Yeah.
And then we have this issue. People might have heard this term phonological delay, phonological disorder. And what this means is that somebody with Down syndrome or otherwise might not have the expected categories of sound.
Okay.
So every language, every culture, every language has categories of sound. We don't all have the same ones. You can think of hearing someone with another language and you're like, we don't have that sound in English, right? So a phonological delay or disorder means you don't have the sounds that everybody else has, or you don't have those categories.
Yeah.
And those categories are at the level of the brain. We all can make a range of sounds that are considered to be accurate.
Okay.
So I'm trying to think of one that can work well here on microphone, and I think the T sound will work. So we can say it, we can move our tongue around within our mouth and say at the front, in the middle, in the back. The sound quality is different, but everybody's going to hear T. If it's too far out from the category, then people are like, that's not a T anymore. I don't understand you.
Yeah.
So you can have, different categories. You can also have just wrong movements. Your categories are right. You know what you're trying to say, but your tongue is not cooperating with you.
Make those. Okay.
So I see that a lot with like the S sound is challenging. People might have airflow that's slightly off.
Mm-hmm.
If there's a lot of those errors, it doesn't affect intelligibility. So being able to understand that person.
Yeah.
Those errors tend to be consistent. R is a classic one for many children where people say, oh, I went to speech therapy because I didn't say R correctly. I said it like a W instead. So it's that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And then a big thing for people with Down syndrome is actually structure. So one way that we might notice that a person has Down syndrome is by like looking at their gorgeous face and seeing some differences in the shape or size of the mouth, nose, and eyes, kind of in the middle of their face. The technical side of that would be the middle of the face is a little small relative to the lower jaw and the top of the head.
Okay.
What that means in speech terms is that you need to be more accurate, which of course is challenging.
It's a challenge.
So you have to have more precision rather than less because there's less space.
Okay.
So the available space to you is smaller.
Okay.
And then the tongue for people with Down syndrome, a lot of people are like, oh, they have a really big tongue. And I can see why people say that because the tongue is large.
It looks bigger, yeah.
Relative to the size of the upper jaw.
Got it.
And it has low muscle tone.
Yeah.
It's not generally large relative to the size of the lower jaw, but there is a bit of a mismatch, if you will, between tongue and upper jaw size. So those two things together make it speech sound accuracy like quite difficult, harder than it would be for a typically developing person. And I think it's important to note that.
Yeah.
Tone, of course, is being able to resist gravity. It's not the same thing as strength. It's different than strength. So we can't just get stronger in our tongue or in our cheeks and then expect speech to be.
Tongue exercises are not going to.
Exactly. We're just going to clear that one up.
Okay.
And then another thing which falls into this sort of sensory awareness umbrella is awareness of where your mouth is in space and how much control you feel like you have over that. And so that's another piece.
Okay.
Now, any one person with Down syndrome might be affected by some or all of these challenges, and figuring out which one is at the center of the tangle is our job as a speech pathologist. We can imagine a bunch of like strings tangled up together.
Yeah.
First, we have to untangle and find which one is at the base of it. What we love to have happen in speech therapy is to work on the root or the central tangle and then see a nice like domino effect down the line. So we don't necessarily have to work on all of the things.
Okay.
We need to work on the hinge piece or the most important part and then see if that can boost several other things that are kind of downstream of that, if you will.
Okay.
Yes, and I think that's kind of as untechnical as I can make it as a description. It's hard is what I want people to get. And
there's a lot
if you have
going
Down
on
syndrome, you're at a big disadvantage
100%,
in speech accuracy.
Okay. I have a few follow-up questions.
I love
you
it.
laid it out beautifully. And just kind of based off, I'm kind of asking these questions from kind of a perspective of what parents sometimes ask me, and I'm like, I don't know, I'm not an SLP, versus me as an OT that wants to learn.
Sure.
Can you talk a little bit about the role of hearing and how that impacts speech? So, because I know oftentimes SLPs will recommend hearing tests, and you do a beautiful job of explaining how that impacts speech.
Yes. So speech is sound. Sound travels in waves.
Okay.
If we need to talk physics for a hot second.
Yeah.
And then those waves are received by your outer ear, funneled first mechanically, and then transformed into a nerve impulse, which is received by your brain. Ears can also not function ideally at many different levels.
Yeah.
But I think we'll save that for a specific audiology one.
Yeah.
If we think about speech and hearing going together, if you don't hear well and you don't hear what other people are saying very well, then it's very hard to get a clear model to base your own speech off of.
Got it. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And so for some people with hearing loss, they might be missing whole phonological categories. They might not hear any H's. They might not hear any S's if it's a high frequency loss. If it's a low frequency loss, they're not hearing vowels very well. That's a problem, both for their understanding and for their own attempts at producing those sounds.
Yeah.
Right? People with hearing loss also have a harder job of being accurate with their volume relative to the environmental noise. So that is difficult. And people with hearing loss also have what we can describe as hearing fatigue.
Okay.
So they have to try much, much harder to get information from the environment. And these individuals with hearing fatigue, their brain gets tired, like at a physiological level, tired. And they cannot, like, the end of the day tends to be quite difficult.
Yeah.
Because their brain is worn out. They've had to focus and work much harder than everybody else to get information that they need all day long. So hearing is a really big deal. This is why we ask for hearing assessments to be done. This is why we ask for hearing to be treated.
And how often would you think is good practice to get your hearing checked?
That really depends on what is happening with the ear. I think the baseline recommendation for people with Down syndrome is every 6 months.
Okay.
I have seen recommendations for every 3 months if there is a middle ear effusion going on, if there's fluid in the ear that's not coming out. The ear structure for people with Down syndrome is also slightly different, particularly with regard to this fancy little tube that goes from inner ear area to the back of your throat. I know it sounds gross, but it's there to drain out the germs and the snot. And for people with Down syndrome, there's not the sort of hill incline angle that there is for typically developing people because of the lower position of the ear. And that means that fluid, read germs and boogers, doesn't drain out of the ear. And then we have this underwater hearing effect. Everything's kind of muffled. Everything's kind of garbled. Imagine trying to learn in that situation. And,
absolutely.
you know, it's really rough. So we see a lot of PE tubes put in. Which are it's the short form for pressure equalization tubes. People with Down syndrome also have small ear canals. Parents will resonate with this when they're being told, too small, can't see, too small, can't see. But that means they can't visualize your eardrum, so they can't see if it's moving. There's also earwax that occludes it. There can be compounding many problems. And it does affect speech. It does.
Perfect. Because that is a first thing that you do check in with a lot of families too, right? When they come to you, it's like, it's one of the very first questions that we ask families.
It is.
Like, when's your last hearing test? What came of it?
Right.
Because it'll help you formulate your plan as well.
Exactly. So if we know, for example, that someone's not hearing high frequency sounds, we're not going to try and work on them. How frustrating would that be?
Exactly.
To have somebody in your face being like, say H. And then you don't hear anything. So you just see somebody opening their mouth and you're like, what is even happening?
What do you
hear? Like, what?
Yeah.
That's the fast track to having a bad time. So we need to know what's going on with hearing, and we, make our recommendations based on how that system is working or not.
Okay. Yeah. And then when you were talking about phonological delay and different languages have different sounds, some languages don't have certain sounds. What are your thoughts on families that have different first languages? Is learning speech going to be difficult for somebody who's English speaking first versus somebody who's speaking another language, or how does that work?
This is such a good question. Okay, so this is a little bit philosophical, but we're just going to go there.
Let's do it. So physics and philosophy, though.
I know. and speech pathology is really fun. If you're wondering, we're having a blast over here. Glenn's having a good laugh about that. I'm being truthful. It's really, really fun. So when we think about kids developing speech and we take a gander and look all over the world, they're pretty much doing it on the same timeline.
Yeah.
No matter what their home language would be. And this tells us that no language is quote unquote harder than any others. In fact, the brain, fancy as it is receptive to basically all sounds.
Okay.
And thinks that they might be meaningful for infants. And it goes through a process later in infancy towards around the first year where it stops paying attention to sounds that seem to not have meaning. Okay. So a child who's exposed to multiple languages early, like really early in life, is going to keep attending to those sounds that are in the environment as they develop.
Yeah.
A child who does not have a multilingual environment later or early in life will start paying attention exclusively to the sounds that they hear in language spoken around them.
Yeah, makes sense.
Does that mean that they can't learn another language? Absolutely not.
Yeah.
Kids' brains are like very gorgeously plastic. That means they can learn and unlearn things.
Yeah.
So if you're like, ooh, I don't know if we should add a second language for my kid, you can add a second language.
Yeah.
You can do that.
Yeah.
And with regards to phonology being different, this is one of the most exciting things about, linguistic diversity on Earth. Languages can be very, very, very different from each other. And languages can be learned. And speech systems, speech repertoires can be learned as well. And there tends to be some degree of overlap between them.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that's really good to know because we do have a variety of families and multilingual families. And so it's good to kind of know what your approach would be in that case.
Yeah.
So let's go to a question that I'm sure you get asked a lot, which is, do all kids with Down syndrome learn to talk eventually?
This is a really good question, and I feel like it looms large for many families, and that's understandable. And the answer here is no. Not all students with Down syndrome become oral communicators or speech users. But that doesn't really give us the whole picture because remember, talking is not the same as communicating. So students with Down syndrome can and do learn communication skills. Whether those are oral skills or augmentative and alternative skills or combination, the students that we see do learn to communicate better. They do not all learn speech as a primary form of communicating, right? And like we said, when you think of yourself, it's highly unlikely that you're only an oral communicator.
Yeah.
Right? You probably use body language, you write things down, you send emojis. And oral communication is a big part of our broader society, but it's not everything.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And it's important to realize that speech is what we call a parasitic function. So using your mouth to make sounds is secondary to breathing and eating. So if you have things going on that compromise your breathing and your eating, your body is going to be focused on those things.
Yeah.
And it should. Those are life-sustaining functions that must happen.
Yeah.
And communication is secondary to that. And I would say as a general rule, the more medical involvement a person has, the longer list of diagnoses, and I'm talking about things like autism, epilepsy, pulmonary hypertension, things of that nature, the more likely it is that that person will rely on other tools to support their communication. Yeah. Not a hard and fast rule, not a universal, but a general trend that I think we can kind of get the lay of the land with. And that's because that list of diagnoses I just listed, those involve the brain and the mechanical aspects of talking, right? And so they can affect how the speech system works. Yeah. I think what I want parents to hear from this is while I say that not everybody with T21 becomes an oral speaker, I want people to release some pressure from themselves and societal pressure to like make that happen for their child. If you have a therapist and you and that person have been working together for a while and speech sounds are not coming, it is really okay to pause speech and focus on communicating in other ways. Speech is like one of my faves, so I'm not going to, ditch it on purpose. But in many regards, language skills are more important than speech skills. The ability to have concepts that you want to share with others is the real key to interacting with people and reducing frustration and making your wants and needs known. And we can do that in many ways. It doesn't have to be speech.
Yeah.
Does that
So
make sense?
and I think you listed a couple of them already, but like under what criteria would you as an SLP start to think about, hey, like let's maybe put speech in the back burner? Because I don't know if you would ever fully give up on the speech goal, because
Sometimes I do.
you sometimes do. Okay, so talk to me about that. So what is your decision-making process around that, and how do you guide families through that process? Because of course it's a bit of a grieving process for families too to give up that.
It is. It's a really hard one. And sometimes speech is just not the priority. And I can think of a few. It doesn't happen that often where we're like, we're not even going to go for this.
Yeah.
Usually when that's conversations being had, it's because there are some other really big priorities in the realm of language that like we need to establish.
Yeah.
If I am seeing big things happening with the brain, a really slidey baseline, that means that like it's not conducive to the person's quality of life to like restart working on speech over and over again as those skills come and go. I would say, ooh, we should really focus on language.
Yeah.
If I am seeing extreme frustration in the form of danger to self or others, I'm going to say we need language here. This child has something to say and it's not working. We need to find a way for them to say this that keeps everybody safe. And that's way more effective. That's going to work better than like the P sound. We don't care about the P sound right now. We care about like what is so scary for this person that they're needing to hurt themselves or other people. If I'm seeing that a person can't move their mouth, right, or can't control their arms or legs, then it's not reasonable. It's not an appropriate expectation to say, okay, let's do M if they don't have an awareness of where their mouth is. And I think later in the episode, we'll talk more about like what kind of questions I run through when somebody comes to me wanting to work on speech and like what I look at in that process. But even speech lover that I am, I start with language. We have things that we need to be able to say in some way so that this frustration doesn't have a chance to build to levels that are like really not sustainable or safe. And then once we have those and the family wants to work on speech as a priority, then we can do sounds.
And I think to a certain degree, if for a particular student, if it's really difficult to make those sounds in the moment, the more pressure we put on them, you know, things can then go the opposite direction where then they're just not motivated to try, right?
Exactly. And if I don't have a way for a person to say, I need a break, and then I proceed to go with an activity that I know is going to be extremely challenging because it sounds that they can't do yet. What are they going to be able to do to show me that it's too hard other than hit me or do something like that? Right? Like you see that, we need language.
Language. Absolutely. And we hear that all the time from schools, especially being like, oh, like we're having behavior issues because they're hitting somebody. But I'm like, but let's dig.
What are you asking them to do?
Hey, what do you think they're trying to communicate more often than not, and just don't have the proper ways? And even like a cautionary tale to teachers and EAs out there, or anybody working with people with Down syndrome, that they don't have to say things like all the letter sounds in a full sentence all the time. Like it needs to be,
everyone listening now knows how complicated that is.
Exactly.
Of people,
absolutely,
to do. And when those things are not coming, quote unquote, naturally or easily, I guess we could say for somebody, then it takes those things that we talked about at the top of the episode, and it means that they do have to be conscious. Right? And imagine if you had to work really hard to get your ideas and then work really hard to plan the movements and then work really hard to hear yourself. And like we're asking a ton of people
in the span of a second, even 2 seconds,
and then not probably giving them enough time to like do the thing. Right? And so
no, that's really good. I'm sure you've heard this quite a bit from the families you work with. Like, oftentimes, like I was told that I shouldn't look for therapy because my kid is not talking yet, which is a real head scratcher and a real eye roller here at TSRF. Is that the right approach, Marla?
No.
No.
No, it's not. So it is a good question though, and I'm really glad to talk about it here because I think there's a lot that we can clear up.
Yeah.
So there are many of these kinds of beliefs. I'm going to list a few, so that if you're listening and you're like, oh, we've received that one. So, these kinds of things are like a person can't do speech until something else is met, such as walking, making some sounds, following directions, being able to use their hands. So no, we can do things in speech therapy before those other things are there or at the same time as those are developing. We don't wait until a child is talking to do therapy. There's really robust evidence that demonstrates that speech develops as a result of these really strong foundation skills in imitation, intention, and reciprocity. Fancy words to say that there's many skills that we work on before speech comes. These include having a reason to communicate or wanting to communicate, right? That means being aware of other people and associating the fact that a person moving their body and making noise is telling me something. And some of my students do start there where we need to work on being aware of other people and environmental noise that has meaning. Right? Another huge skill that we very regularly focus on is the ability to imitate.
Yeah.
And when you think about it, kids learn to talk by hearing other people talking and then repeating the sounds or words that they've been hearing. And we can make imitation break down into many, many sub-steps. So that we can work on the underlying goals there, like paying attention to people, being able to move your mouth, having a reason to communicate, having a back and forth turn-taking thing. Right? So early imitation skills looks like being able to move your body in the same way that another person is moving their body, being able to make sound effects, being able to move your mouth, like open your mouth and say, ah. And then, only then, after we have like pretty good and consistent control over a lot of those things, do we start trying to get a person to be able to say sounds in speech, right? And then that leads to words. We do not start at words. We start like way, 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 way back. So all of those sub-steps are addressed in therapy. Those are good reasons to come in and see somebody. If you have a person who's not saying speech sounds yet, or not saying words yet, and now you don't need to be surprised when you start working on things that are big body movements first. It might be helpful, I think, to have my sort of flow chart of mental questions that I use. So when a person, comes in to see me and the parent's primary concern is around speech sounds, here's what I look at. So I check, is this child observably aware of their parent or of me? And these can be like very subtle things. So I'm watching somebody's eyes to see, not eye contact. I don't want people to get that from it. I'm watching, are somebody's eyes attending or moving if somebody walks out of the room or comes back? Right? I'm watching body orientation. Does somebody purposefully orient themselves towards or away from other people in the room? I'm watching muscle movement. Sometimes we see some sorts of like twitching or some really subtle movements that indicate that they're aware that somebody else is there. Right? This can be both in young children and in older children. Then I check, does this person have the intention to communicate something? I'm watching for grabbing, reaching, throwing, eye gaze, mouthing, right? Then I look at sound. Does this person make any sound at all? Can they cry? Can they laugh? Do they have a happy sound or a frustration sound? What kind of sounds? Do the parents have a sense of that? Do they associate a certain sound with a certain scene? So I'm watching that. Does this child have the ability to imitate me? That's my next question I ask myself. And if so, what does it look like? Can they raise their arm if I raise my arm? Can they march if I march? Can they make silly faces in a mirror? Can they make a letter sign? Can they blow a kiss? Can they go into a bucket? Those kinds of things. If they can do those kind of things, then I say, ooh, can we do a speech sound? Can we do an sound or a buh sound? And so we progress through those stages. And this kind of helps me get to a starting place.
Yeah.
You've probably noticed that only the last one actually had, quote unquote speech sounds.
Speech
and that's
sounds,
because there's so many things that precede that. And we can't jump in with sounds if they're not meaningful for the child.
Yeah.
What's the point of that? That's wasting everybody's time.
Yeah.
If the child doesn't have control over their mouth,
Yeah.
we're asking the impossible of them in that moment.
And I feel like that would make it more difficult to learn some of those complex things later on. If we look at this, you
can't skip.
Try not to skip the basics. You got to keep with the foundations, right?
That's right.
And it's so important. And you were mentioning early on about some of those foundations, even if they're not necessarily making words yet. So, oftentimes when we have very young students here, we hear a lot of babbling.
Yeah.
Right? Make a lot of noises with their mouths. And oftentimes I'll have families who will be like, yeah, they're just making noises. But I often have seen our SLPs here, you're maybe even imitating that sound back too.
Sure.
So talk just a little bit about babbling and kind of, is that considered like an early form of speech?
Yes. So babbling is in the developmental process. We love babbling. If someone comes in babbling, we're like, ooh, we are on our way.
Yeah.
This is awesome. So for people who are not familiar, babbling is like the ba ba ba, goo goo ba 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 ba, those kinds of things. And kids are learning about their mouths in that moment. We want to have a lot of it.
Yeah.
The sort of general rule is there that we need kids to get like quite loud and noisy before we can channel that into some speech.
Okay.
That's for both typical and less typical.
And why is that? Like, what does the loudness have to?
So what a kid is doing there is they're experimenting.
Okay.
And they're trying to figure out what parts of their mouth make what sounds. This is why we want kids to be able to hear themselves.
Gotcha.
This is where that self-monitoring comes in so importantly because motor plans and programs, so movement sequences, are developed through practice. If you think about learning piano, the only way you're doing that is through practicing and being able to make it automatic. And this is
muscle memory.
This is that. This is muscle memory. This is saying, ooh, okay, lips together makes buh, buh, buh. And getting and hearing it, saying it, kids will change their intonation. Yeah. Right? And so babbling usually goes from what we call canonical babbling, because we're such nerds. This is your ba, 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 ba.
Okay.
To variegated babbling, where kids are experimenting further. Ba-dee, goo-dee, ba-ba, bee-ba, ba-ba. More variety in the sounds, more consonant variation. And this is the foundational stuff. We want to hear it.
Yeah.
It's funny, I have a lot of kids who do babble, but they do so in private. They don't want people around when they try this out. So it'll be like in the crib before the parents get up, and parents report to me, oh, on the video monitor, I can see them chatting up a storm to themselves. Great. Love that. Yeah. Encourage it. Or, oh, they only do it, when it's already loud, like in the laundry room when things are going, and then they'll try their sounds. That's fine too. Yeah. Whatever works. Everybody's different. Yeah. But babbling is something that we love to see happening. Yeah. It gives us some nice templates for word structures later. Being able to do multiple syllables, being able to change the consonants in those syllables. It is something that comes later for by far the majority of kids with Down syndrome. Yeah. And that is fine. Yeah. That is one thing that we love to see happening though. Yeah. For sure. Okay. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, no, that's great. And I think it is just, even from an OT perspective, we cannot skip the basics.
Can't skip.
No. Because I think if we do skip the basics, that is just doing a disservice and not really giving, the full toolkit for further complex development. So.
Yeah. And I realized a part of your question that I just skipped is the sort of odd happenings of the therapist copying what the kid is saying.
Yeah.
And like, what are we doing there?
Yeah.
Great question.
Yeah.
We are trying to get some turn taking going. What we want to see is the child's awareness coming online of the basics, foundations of conversation. Yeah. I say something, you say something. Yeah. I say something, you say something. This also builds this imitation. So what you might hear in a therapy session is the child go, blah, blah, blah. And the SLP goes, blah, blah, blah. Yeah. And then the child goes, blah, blah, blah. And then the SLP after that goes, B, B, B. and they're changing it and they want to see, okay, we have this back and forth going. Can you copy me?
Yeah.
Right. And once the back and forth is established, it is more likely that the child is like, whoa, you did something different. Can I do that? And they will try. Right. So it's in this process of developing imitation. We do look bizarre. We know.
And, well, I know. Like, it's funny because I picked up some of that too, even though I'm not an SLP. If a kid's like on his swing in the gym and they're like, and we're like, oh, look, bubbles, right? So you're just like introducing words. You're not asking them or them to copy it, but you're just like, oh, you could say bubbles or any formation or any form of bubbles, right? So,
and my overall experience is that kids really like to realize that they are making you do something.
Yeah.
You get this kind of cheeky look, like, ooh, what is this? And then they will do it again. And it's a fun interaction, right? And the more fun that our students have, the faster they can learn.
Absolutely.
So we want it to be fun for them.
Yeah. Great. Okay, I'm going to take a slight step over to technology. So we've had an episode in the Lowdown about this a few seasons ago, but oftentimes families will come to you and say that my therapist told me that, you know, my child needs an app to talk. And oftentimes that means families are worried that it means that they will never, you know, develop speech or speak in the more conventional way. So what are your thoughts on that?
This is a really good, valid question. And my feeling of it is that it comes from this place of wanting the child to blend in with peers, have an easier time out there in the world. And for me, though, part of being included means that a person can be understood and make their needs known and have those met as independently as possible. And most often, I find when a family comes to see me and I notice these really clever strategies that a person is using to demonstrate their understanding, they like the things like a cheeky sense of humor or some really good comedic timing or a response to what adults are talking about. This lets me know that the child is thinking at a more complex level than their mouth is able to show. And this is, you know, it's in line with what parents say, who report that their child, you know, understands a lot more than they can say. And so my observations tend to reflect their lived experience. And the way I see my role here is to find a way for the child to share what they're thinking. So that their expressive communication, the concepts they can share, can match their thinking.
Okay.
If we live with this mismatch between what the mouth can do and what you can think, there tends to be a really incredible frustration and agitation that we see, which makes sense, right? I would do the same thing. I would be so upset if the things that I could think in my mind could not be made known to other people
in the way that I,
oh my gosh, how aggravating, right? And so AAC, things like apps, things like writing it down, can be used from a really early age to give these kids and young adults and teens a means to reliably communicate while their imitation skills are developing, or maybe while their imitation skills are not developing. But what I want for all of my students is for their thoughts that they want to share to be made known to other people, right? And like my personal ties, even though I love speech, I'm not married to speech as the only way to get that to happen. Many students learn to access a device successfully before their mouth, like, quote unquote, catches up to what they want to be able to communicate. And this really reduces frustration. Further than that, it serves to model speech sounds for the kids. So we can all guess. We think we know what's most important to the student or the child, but we're guessing. We could be wrong. And what I often see happening when someone does have access to an AAC is this. The child figures out their device, they go through a period of babbling, hitting all the buttons, figuring out where everything is. Then they move to intentional communication. And at this stage, they find the buttons they care about the most. They press those buttons. And they try to copy what the button is saying. They're doing their own speech homework.
It's like,
right?
This is where that imitation thing comes in handy as well. Right? It's like a device that's helping you learn. Too.
And they press what they care about. Not what we think that they care about, not what we think they should care about, but what they like really want to be saying. that's what they find.
Yeah.
That's what they press, and that's what they try to copy.
Yeah.
So perfect. They're doing their own practice, their own homework. And this kind of very long explanation I've just been giving is to say that AAC supports communication, including speech, rather than detracting from it. So it doesn't mean that we're
on this.
there's a lot of research
For everybody listening out there.
yeah. And it doesn't mean that we're quote unquote giving up on speech. It doesn't mean that they will never learn to talk. If anything, it makes it faster and it makes people less agitated and upset.
Yeah, it's just another tool in the toolkit. Yeah.
You know, further to this conversation, we're just going to go for it. So we're going to address this idea of laziness. So really, really often I hear complaints that a student is lazy or just not trying. And every time I hear this, I know that I have a lot of work to do.
Yeah.
And I'm not here to shame anybody who said that or thought that about their child. We're all whole people with all of our feelings. Usually I feel like these statements are made in grief or in sadness that something's so hard for their child, right? And for many people, it's easier to find a way to blame that on like personality, which you want to be able to change or motivate, rather than something physiological, neurological, or cognitive that you don't feel like you have any control over, right?
Yeah.
And understandably, most people don't have experience in supporting somebody with those challenges, and it feels like very overwhelming. So it's a lot easier to think to yourself, well, they're probably just being lazy, rather than like, ooh, there's this like neural tract in their brain that's not firing fast enough. Because like, what can we do about that, right?
They're just unable to do. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So we did speak about, you know, the speech mechanics in detail at the top of the episode. And all of those things are true. And that's not even like the full picture of it, because students are also affected by their health, their mood, their sensory perceptions, and the demands of having to keep up with a daily routine that's not at their speed.
Yeah.
Right? So if we use a gas in the tank kind of analogy, it's easier to understand that all of the gas in the tank can be used towards these other needs, and that leaves very little left towards this complicated speech thing, which has to be very conscious and thought through for many of our students who have working memory capacity to that's smaller than other people's. So, and I also think we can pretty safely assume that people want to be able to use their voice and their speech freely, easily, and effectively. And if a student could do that, they would be doing that. It's speaking orally is easier in many ways than having to carry an iPad around with you. And if somebody could do that reliably, they'd be doing it.
They'd be doing it.
Trust me. They want to have their arms free for like carrying something more fun. You know? So if the child is like regularly running out of gas, so to say, not able to speak, right? And it's able, not that they don't want to. It's
willingness, exactly.
Their energy is being used elsewhere. Here's what I'm going to ask myself. What's going on with their health, their sleep, and their nutrition? Let's figure those things out first so we have more gas for things like speaking. Does this child, my second question, does the child have a way to communicate reliably? And this is often where we come back around to AAC then, right? Because if we know this kid is running out of gas and they are not communicating orally through much of the day or predictable times of the day, they're getting sick a lot, they're losing skills here and there, it takes a long time for them to come back. Well, we need something that accommodates them when they're really not doing well. Right? We can push the frontiers of their ability when they're doing well. And they're healthy and they're sleeping. And when they're not feeling so good, what do we do then? Right? We need to accommodate that.
I have a couple of follow-ups with AAC, and this is not an AAC only episode. We've had those in the past. And actually this season, when you were talking about how, you know, when you have so many ideas and you just can't get them out using your speech alone, it's nice to have the assistive and augmentative communication.
That's right.
So we do have a really great student spotlight this season where if you listen to our two students that we interview, and it's a very good example of how, you know, you can have speech and use AC and how one helps the other. But my question for you was, for families that are listening and maybe they have really little ones right now, when do they decide like, okay, want to work on speech, but should I start AAC really early to help with speech development, or should I work on speech first, see how that goes, and then bring AAC? And like, where, at what point would that
groovy
happen?
Groovy. Good question. So when we think about language first, that applies also to really young children.
Yeah.
It's pretty well known in the community that kids with Down syndrome, they're sort of like mouth being online, so to speak, and ready to work on imitation and speech sounds takes a while. You know, age 3, age 4, age 5, 6, that's not unusual in this group. However, that doesn't mean that those guys don't have ideas and things that they want to be able to say.
Yeah.
And in those same ages, we can see behavior challenges crop up like never before because kids are getting mad because they're not being understood.
Yeah.
So my answer to you is really young. When I see a gap or when a parent reports a gap, like I think they know what's going on, but they can't tell me.
Can't tell you, yeah.
Speech is the long road. The very long road. We usually work really hard. If we're doing speech, it's like one sound at a time, one phonological category at a time, one speech skill at a time. Language, through things like AAC, can be reached much faster.
Yeah.
Kids are pretty onto it where they're like, oh, that works.
Yeah.
Right? And they get that pretty quick, especially if people are responsive to it. That's essential.
Yeah.
You know, if the kid presses a button that says, I need a break, and that results in them getting a break
right away,
well, they never need to learn to hit then.
Yes, exactly.
Right? Like, that's a win.
Yeah.
So language early, I'm regularly figuring out some kind of AAC, not always an iPad, could be on paper, could be many sorts of things for kids who are 3, kids who are 4, kids who are not in school yet. We do that. If a child shows me some ability to use eye gaze or point or grab or reach, then we can do some kind of AAC thing, which gives us language.
Perfect.
Once we've got that off the ground, we can come back to speech and work on sounds.
And more, you have to work on them together, right?
Yep.
It doesn't have to be one or the other, which is generally the best way to work.
Yes, I would say the majority of my people, we have a kind of combo thing going on, a language type goal, which could be through AAC, and a speech type goal. Yeah. Those kind of things. Yeah.
Wonderful. Okay, this leads us perfectly to kind of our closing question.
For sure.
So for families that are listening, how can they get the most from therapy?
What a zinger. Okay. Oh, I have some pointers for that.
Okay, wonderful.
How do we get the most from therapy? Well, number 1, communicate with your therapist. So therapy is most effective when we have a clear goal and a clear understanding of like what's happening with this child when they're not here in front of us. So this includes things like medication changes, schedule changes, health status, because you should know that based on what we see in a session, we change things for the next session.
Yeah.
So and we spin our wheels like very fruitlessly if we change things because we think it happened because of something we did, and then it's actually because of something else, like they were super constipated and therefore on the floor, or they had a new medication and therefore things went a bit sideways or something like that.
Yeah.
So if there are things changing for the child, please do let us know so that we don't make things too easy or too hard for the next time. Right. And we're very receptive to those kind of things. And we can change things on the fly.
Yeah. And you want to consider the whole person, right?
Yes.
Like on that given day. And it's so different.
Yeah. We only get these little snapshots.
Yeah.
And we do tend to think of ourselves as like so awesome. So we can tend to over attribute the child's performance to like what we did and planned.
Yeah.
When more likely it probably has more to do with what kind of sleep did they have?
Yeah.
Did they eat? You know, those kinds of things. Like we need to know that stuff. So that's number 1.
Okay.
Let your therapist know what's up. If your goals change, if you don't understand what is happening and why your therapist is making weird sounds, like definitely tell them that.
Okay.
Number 2, be as specific as possible. So our recommendations are most impactful when they relate to your real life, right? So for example, a really specific thing would be saying like, I want my child to be able to say sound. So when they see me, they can let me know that they want me to come by going, which is like the start of mom, right?
Yeah.
This is super helpful, and it really helps us help you to generalize it so that we can give you the appropriate tips and tricks for your home life,
Yeah.
right? Specific is good. If you need help on like how to be specific, you can ask. Like, I think I want to work on speech, for example. I'm not sure what though.
What that means.
That would be fine. We would be more than happy to talk to you about what would be involved with those kinds of things. My number 3, still a communication related thing, would be to ask questions. If something is confusing or unclear, ask. Jump in, ask.
Yeah.
Therapy is done through play, right? But don't let that trick you into thinking that there's no working going on. So your therapist can let you know in adult terms exactly what they're after in the game that you're playing if it's not clear to you, like what is happening.
Yeah.
And often in one game, therapists are doing several things at once. And they're happy to list that for you if you're like, why are we playing Tea Party? Like, what is happening? Or what is with this pop-up pirate? What's going on here?
Yeah.
So that's fine. And then my last thing is a kind of a two-parter, but it's be realistic with yourself and how much time you can devote to therapy and practice. And it is okay if it's not the right time. Therapy, like, as cool as we think we are, therapy doesn't do very much if it's not carried over outside of the therapy room. If you don't have the capacity to try things at home or work on things, it's okay.
Yeah.
Like, it's really okay.
Yeah.
That just means that therapy is not a good fit for right now. Therapy should happen within the context of the family and the child-parent dynamic together. And it's okay to tell your therapist you need a break. That's actually being a really good parent.
Yes.
Saying like, hey, for our families right now, like we can't.
Yeah.
We can't do that.
Yeah. And not feeling bad about it.
No, yeah, no. I put the child-parent relationship first.
Absolutely.
So if I'm asking you to do things that are causing you stress at home, that's bad. That's not what I want.
Yeah.
You got to tell me those things so that we can do something differently.
Yeah.
Because therapy should not be damaging to the parent-child rapport.
Absolutely. Yeah.
That's a big no-no.
Yeah.
And a fancy hot tip from me, as a parent who's a therapist as well, who also has kids that need therapy, I'm going to tell you right now, I can't do it all. And my husband cannot either. So even if we could like bring our kids to all of these appointments, we cannot do all the home practice.
Yeah.
Even though we know therapy is great.
Yeah.
We can't do it.
Yeah.
So rather than us feeling bad about it, we pick the one area that needs the most help and we do that for a while.
Yeah.
Then we pivot as we need to the next therapy or stick with the same one if we're thinking we still need more of that.
Yeah.
And to be clear, we do have a team of people that we can contact if something goes wild or something comes up. We do not see our whole team every week. We don't even see our whole team every month.
Yeah.
Do I realize that this is bad business? Yes, I do. But I'm here to tell you that this is good therapy. It's good, right? I'm not in this to make the big dollars. I'm in this to tell you what will help you in therapy.
Exactly. Yeah. No, that's a great way to end this because I think, like you said, speech is a lifelong, as I'll use a very tired cliche here. It's not a sprint, it's a marathon.
It sure is.
And it takes lots of time. And I think for our population and our people with Down syndrome specifically, there's so much variability in their day-to-day life medically, right? And physically and socially and emotionally that we do need to continue to pivot and rearrange goals. What are your thoughts on some of those speech therapy or speech development programs that are out there? Like, do you have any cautions from families that are just like, hey, there's this program that says that, you know, if you use these tools and these whistles and these things that are going to help my kid talk, what is your perspective on some of those things and how do you decide? Do you use a particular program at DSRF? Like, what is your intervention planning mindset briefly?
Awesome. Well, there are many programs that sell many things. And what I can say about those is that research conditions don't match real life conditions very well. So the fidelity of treatment or like how closely the program was stuck to or matched in research very rarely happens in real life, which means that the results that they found in research based on drill practice with a certain kind of chewy, munchy, whistly thing is almost no families can actually do that at that intensity to make that result happen. And so I am hesitant to recommend those things because I think it sets people up with these kind of false expectations. That being said, if a family's like very keen and they're like, we're doing it, I'm like, okay, here's what it looks like. And like, I'm not going to not do it if a family is like super on board with that. I think you can spend a lot of money on tools that are not going to help you very much. So before you buy things, talk to your therapist about like where they think your kid is at, and they can probably give you some specifics, like if you want to buy things. I think a lot of things like this are marketed to people who are feeling a bit maybe desperate, or they really, really want to see change for their child. And they're willing to throw dollars at it because they feel like if it's available that they should. And I'm going to say no. You don't need to buy lots of things most of the time. Most of the time, right? There are some instances where we do need to buy things. So that's that. As with regards to like, do we do one certain thing? No. We do lots of different things, and that's because we see lots of different students who are starting at different places. We have many, many different kinds of programs, and we customize everything based on who's there, who their parents are, what they can do in their home life or not, right? And so there's, we don't, no canned approach that we've ever seen would fit for everybody. Great.
Just wanted to throw that in there. So do you have any resources or anything you would like, we'll put a whole bunch of really great things on our episode page, but if you have anything for families to kind of go to as their first contact?
So I have made some videos about how speech works and how hearing works and how to read an audiology report. And I think we'll put those in. And then there are some early language things that I can add in. There are some early language programs. A lot of the CDC stuff, or like the Child Development Center stuff, is based on early language for the reasons that I've expounded on at length here. So that's all cool. And I can put some things in about phonological development. It's pretty nerdy stuff, but we can do that. I think, if anything, if you're curious about this, your speech therapist is probably as nerdy as me. So you should probably ask them about it and get answers that are like directly related to your child, because like we've talked about, everybody's in a different place.
Great. Well, thank you so much. It has been a really, really great discussion. I've learned a lot. I'm sure our listeners have learned a lot. And I think it is a really good opportunity to kind of sit with this episode and kind of reflect on the amount of work that it takes for, our loved ones with Down syndrome to say just a word or a sound, and versus how easy it is for a lot of us. So it's a good perspective taking exercise, but it's also been really, really helpful. And talk to your SLPs, check out the resources Marla has noted. They'll be on our episode page. And Marla, I don't know why it took this long to get you here, but
I was hiding.
You were hiding, but we were so appreciative. And thank you so much for really kind of helping us understand what speech is and why it is so important. Thank you.
Sure. Absolutely my pleasure.
Okay.
I'm sure everyone got their ear talked off there.
No. That's great. There's lots of nerds out there that will enjoy it, and even those that are not nerds, it's very important information. So thank you.
No problem. My pleasure.